Okay, here's a quick little demonstration on mixing your colors. I'm using that saturation chart that you guys are doing as the example. I didn't set up the parameters exactly the same, but I'm using this mostly to show you guys how to mix your paint, how to clean your brushes, and how to store your paint, okay? So this is that saturation chart. So whenever you're just deciding what color to use, right, choose a complementary pair. Start with one of your primary colors. So if you're doing a red-green, start with your red and choose either your cadmium or your alizarin. And then that choice is going to determine the type of green that you make, okay? So I've chosen my alizarin crimson. So you want to describe your color in two letters, right? A primary color and a secondary. And alizarin crimson is a violet red, right? Like it leans into the magenta side, not the orange side. So if this is an RV, a red violet, then the opposite of that is going to be opposite of red is green, opposite of violet is yellow, so a yellow green. Okay, so clearly no matter what you'll be mixing a green, but the amount of yellow to blue and the type of blue is going to change according to the red that you chose. So I am starting with my alizarin or my processed magenta, and it's given me the chance to mix up my green. So knowing about my colors the way I do, I already know that my yellow is less dominant than my cerulean. So I'm choosing my cerulean because it's closer to the yellow-green on the co-primary color wheel. So I chose the right blue, not the ultramarine, but the cerulean. And then I've chosen my yellow. And I know that my cerulean has more pigment in it. So I've used so much less of this, okay, than my yellow. And the green that I make might have to change. So the proportions are going to be kind of not fixed until you start mixing your neutral. And it might take a little bit more blue or a little bit more yellow in conjunction with your alizarin to really neutralize. And that's what you're doing, is finding true complement. Okay? So I've set up my graph. Always tape off your edges, pre-measure off your 1-inch squares if that's what you're creating, and underneath me is my glass palette. So I use a fairly large glass palette. That way I can kind of place my work in the center, and I can mix paint around. This method probably only works if you're planning on cutting your chart out, so I'm not really concerned about the outer edge of my chart because I'm going to cut it out and I'm going to glue it onto another piece of Bristol board. So if you're doing this in a clean manner and you don't want to cut out your chart, which is totally fine, don't place your final piece on the palette in which you are mixing. Now the glass palette that I use is a tempered glass, okay? Don't use a thin glass that you would find in a window. This is more like car glass, so it's tempered and it has a round edge. A cheap place to go is Mendelssohn's in Dayton, and there's just a whole room full of glass palettes for absolutely nothing. They're very cheap. Like this would cost about $2 for this small glass palette. And your glass palette can be cleaned, it can be razored, you can reuse it over and over again. So I really like having the palette in order to mix on, but if you don't, just get palette paper, okay? Something you can throw away. So I've set up my alizarin and I've set up my green to do my saturation chart. I'm going to go ahead and let this play and loop while I'm talking. So when I'm mixing up my green, you're going to learn a lot about your blue to your yellow, right? The quality of your cerulean is going to depend on how much of each. This is not something I can answer for you because every single person in these classes are going to have different kinds of paint, and every paint's going to react differently. Golden, the expensive end of acrylic, will go down really opaquely. It will take less paint, and it'd probably go down in a single layer. I'm using a really cheap brand, and it takes multiple layers to get the red to actually layer red, and it takes a couple layers to get the green layered as well. So I know that a lot of you have questions about like how much paint to mix, how much to put on my brush. Um, None of that can be answered. I can't answer that because I don't have your paint. I can answer it for this particular brand, um, but that's it. So these painting projects are experiential. So I can't tell you. You have to figure it out. You have to figure out which colors are dominant, which colors are subordinate and weak, right? And how to start figuring out how much of one can manipulate the other. So this is all experience, and that's why you're doing these charts instead of doing a painting. So you're just painting squares because you are learning about the viscosity of your paint, meaning the thickness or thinness. You're learning about the opacity of your paint. How opaque is it, or how transparent is it? Alizarin crimson is almost always very transparent. Okay, it comes from a plant-based pigment, and it tends to be very transparent. Whereas cadmium comes from a mineral, and it's more opaque. But you're just going to learn about these things by mixing, okay? So if you can see, I've got my palette knife for mixing. And remember, your palette knife for mixing is your straight palette knife. Right there. Okay? This palette knife does not have a bent neck. It has a straight, long knife. And that is very good for mixing. So when I mix, what I'm doing is I'm getting under the paint and I'm flipping it. I'm flipping the paint. Okay? And one side of the knife I keep clean, and one side of the knife is where the paint stays on. So I flip it like a pancake, and then I smash it down. Okay, right there. Just smashing the paint down. And then I flip it and I smash it down. And the back side of my knife stays really clean. So if you let both sides get really covered in paint, it's really hard to control. I'm also really putting pressure on my knife and it's bending significantly. Okay, so I'm getting a good flex and I'm getting hard under the paint. Now, I can do this a lot on my glass palette because I'm working with a hard surface. If you're working with palette paper, it's going to be harder, so you might have to tape that palette paper down so it doesn't move on you. This is one of the benefits of using the glass palette. So all I'm doing is flipping the paint and I'm systematically smashing the paint down, and then I flip it again until I get a good mixture. Okay? The reason you want to use your knife is that if you use your brush to mix your paint, you're going to embed paint in the base of your brush, and then it's going to ruin your brush. You're also going to have to clean your brush much more vigorously in between colors if you mix with a brush. So you're gonna dirty the color, okay? And by using your knife, you're not gonna dirty that color. It's gonna be much easier to keep it clean, okay? And I just have a rag with me at all times, and I pull my knife through the rag, okay? And I pull it clean. And I do that with my brush as well. I just pull the paint right off of the paintbrush from the base, okay? Okay. Whenever you're working, you might want to have a couple really absorbent rags or towels and get rid of them as you go. Kind of keep them clean. And then also you might want to have clean water and dirty water so that when you're cleaning off your brush, you're going to your dirty water, and then when you go from your clean water to just add a little bit of water to your brush, it's nice and clean and it hasn't been dirtied, okay? You always want to start with your brightest, most saturated colors before you get into your project because your brush is going to get dirtier and dirtier. So I always start with my really saturated, red, and then let that layer dry, and then I go mix my green. And by the way, the green changes from the first layer to the second. If you notice, I started here with a more yellow-green because that was my guesstimate to the complement to this color. But as I started mixing my neutral, I had to add a little bit more blue or a little bit more yellow, and it altered my proportion of my green, and my green became a little bit more blue-green in relationship to this alizarin crimson, this processed magenta. And then I ended up with a neutral that was pretty neutralized. It doesn't have a lot of color in it, right? Like whenever I look at this color, I don't really say green, I don't say red. I've removed the color, okay? It doesn't mean it's gonna be gray, it just lacks hue. I did that with a green that had more blue in it, which means I had to repaint my lime green that I initially guessed. And that's fine because you really want to get a layer of paint down first anyways. There you go. And then I switch my green to a truer complement, and I learned about that complement by mixing my neutral. Okay, so this is one way you learn about how to find a true complement. Now, you're going to mix more paint than you need, okay? So you're going to need this neutral because you're going to have to add a little red to it to get the color in between these. And then you're going to have to add a little green to it to get the color in between these. So mix much more paint than you need. Do not be skimpy on your paint because you're not going to have enough to do this project, okay? I also want you to see that right about here I start bagging some of my paint so that I can keep it for later, okay? So I got through this bit and I want to save my neutral. So I get out my saran wrap right here, okay? And I place the paint in the middle of my hand in the saran wrap, this paint that I want to save. Go ahead and put a couple colors together if you don't have enough to save. Like you need enough in here to make it worth bagging. So I took a bunch of my neutralized color and I mixed it all together and I got a decent dab of paint. And I close up that saran wrap around the paint to make like a little tube of paint. Okay, right there. So I've taken all the air out and I've squeezed it all to one end, and you can tape it or tie something around it, and then when you want to use it, all you have to do is get a blade out and poke it. Okay, right there. So whenever I want to use this paint, I just take my X-Acto blade and poke it and squeeze out the paint, and I've just basically created my own tube of paint. And that's how you can get the paint out. And the paint in this form, if you've gotten all the oxygen out, could last a good 6 months if there's enough paint in there. And if you've poked a hole and not used it all, just let the paint congeal on the outside because acrylic will seal itself, okay? And then you got this little paint that you didn't have to throw away, and you can keep this for a long time. Keep your neutrals, they really come in handy. In terms of cleaning, you're going to want to kind of clean up your brushes and knives the way I've showed you by taking the knife through your rag. And then here I've got my soap my painter's soap right here. I put a little water in there with my brush, move it around, and I clean my brush really well. And this soap also conditions your brushes. So I really like this stuff. It comes in this little container. Just put a little water, clean out your brush, and it works really well to clean the acrylic out. And then clean your soap. Don't leave that dirty water in there. Okay, so that'll be a great way to maintain your materials. Use your knife for mixing, clean your brushes from the base, pulling that paint out, okay? All right, good luck.